In January of 2000, issue 103 of Wizard magazine contained a small article about the passing of former Marvel Comics bullpen artist Artie Rosen.
Rosen had been all but forgotten by the comic reading public. He never had that definitive Marvel character like Jack Kirby with the Fantastic Four or Steve Ditko with Spider-Man.
Except that almost wasn't the case. 1 month later, it was discovered that Rosen and Stan Lee had actually teamed up to create a superhero before the Fantastic Four came out.
This would be the Sentry, the alter ego of Robert Reynolds, a college student who drank a serum that granted him the power of 1 million exploding suns. Or, in other words, strength, flight, invulnerability, etc. Basically, he would have been Marvel's attempt at a Superman-esque superhero.
It was then announced that writer Paul Jenkins and artist Jay Lee, fresh off an award-winning run on the Inhumans, would be teaming up to reintroduce the Sentry into the Marvel Comics universe. The rub being, not only had the Sentry been forgotten by the people at Marvel Comics, but the heroes inside Marvel Comics had also forgotten him. And that's what we're looking at today. This is the Sentry.
Bob Reynolds wakes up in a cold sweat. He tells his wife Lindy that it was caused by a storm outside, but he knows it's much more serious than just thunder and lightning. He takes the dog that he and Lindy own down the stairs of their run-down home and pulls out a book. Inside the book is a bottle. That bottle contains what used to make Bob Reynolds something. The serum in the bottle is what made Bob into the Sentry, the man with the power of 1 million exploding suns. He remembers the glory days when he took the serum, got superpowers, and won Lindy's heart, back before the Void took everything. The presence of his longtime foe is what woke Bob up. The Void is coming back, and only the Sentry would be able to stop him. He drinks the serum and starts to open the closet door containing his costume, only to be interrupted by the dog, which has actually turned out to be the Void. Bob screams and lashes out, causing Lindy to come rushing down the stairs. She finds Bob cowering in the corner from the dog that he just kicked. The bottle of serum? Well, it's really just a bottle of booze. The costume? Just a dusty old leather jacket. Bob Reynolds isn't a superhero. He's just an agoraphobic alcoholic trapped in a now loveless marriage. Fed up with her husband's antics, Lindy informs Bob that she is going to the house of the couple's daughter, June, and takes the pets with her. As she leaves, Bob puts on the old leather jacket, which is now sporting a cape for some reason, and flies off. Bob goes to 4 Freedoms Plaza, home of the Fantastic Four, where he sits on top of a crane doing some construction work in the area. This has attracted the attention of Reed Richards, who's mystified at just how Bob avoided security. Bob points out that he's visited the Baxter building numerous times. After all, Reed was the best man at Bob's wedding, gave the speech and everything. Problem is, Reed has no memory of ever meeting Bob. Bob then mentions a unicorn before disappearing. Haunted by Bob's final words, Reed goes back to Fantastic Four headquarters, where Ben and Johnny are arguing about what to watch on TV. Reed asks Sue if they were ever at a wedding with a unicorn. As Sue racks her brain, Reed suddenly notices a golden unicorn statue that he never noticed before. Memories of the wedding slowly begin to come back to Reed as he inspects the statue. At the base of the statue is a VHS tape labeled Wedding Video. Reed pops in the tape, and the Fantastic Four are stunned by what they see. The tape is of Reed Richards giving a message to himself. If he's watching this, the world is doomed. The Reed on the videotape begins to elaborate on just who Robert Reynolds is, only for it to suddenly short out and burst into flames. Meanwhile, Bob has managed to reconnect with another friend, the Incredible Hulk. Hulk instantly recognizes Bob without any trouble when the Golden Man, as Hulk's name for the Sentry, mentions the return of the Void. Hulk absolutely freezes in fear. Bob's outfit slowly begins to take the form of the Sentry's costume as he moves on to another superhero, Spider-Man. Bob points out that he won Peter Parker a Pulitzer Prize and shows him the award-winning photo. Except all Spidey sees is a blank piece of paper. Bob tells Spider-Man to look up Clarion Magazine issue number 743 as he leaves. Back with Reed Richards, he checks the FF's computer to see if Bob Reynolds is who he says he is. Reed also searches through his files for more information. This prompts the arrival of Dr. Strange. Reed asks Strange what is going on. Strange responds that Reed is the one who instructed him not to answer such a question. Reed realizes that Strange was the one who destroyed the videotape earlier. As this is happening, Bob goes to visit Charles Xavier. Xavier manages to discern the Sentry's identity and promises to help with the Void. Meanwhile, Peter Parker searches through the Daily Bugle's archives for Clarion 743. It's missing, almost as if it had never existed. Also, the picture Bob Reynolds gave him is slowly starting to come into focus. Meanwhile, Bob Reynolds has moved on to Tony Stark. Stark recognizes the Sentry almost immediately. Bob asks what caused the other heroes to turn on him. It's a new memory that had just entered Bob's mind. Stark has no recollection as to what led the heroes to do what they did. Meanwhile, the Sentry's old headquarters, the Watchtower, have mysteriously appeared in downtown Manhattan. Also, a disfigured one-armed man named Billy Turner wakes up screaming.
Billy Turner was the Sentry's former sidekick, Scout, and he lost his arm and got several disfiguring scars after an encounter with the Void.
The Sentry's costume is fully formed as he approaches the Watchtower. Upon entering the structure, Sentry is greeted by the building's computer, Clock. Inspecting Clock reveals a transmitter emitting a signal designed to essentially scramble the memory of everyone. Sentry orders Clock to disable the transmitter, however the computer is unable to comply. When asked who installed the transmitter and gave the order to leave it alone, Clock replies, Reed Richards. Sentry then takes it upon himself to take out the transmitter. Around the world, the memory of the Sentry begins to return, in particular a funeral where Reed Richards accused his former friend of taking mafia kickbacks. As this is happening, Billy Turner grabs his old scout costume and begins traveling to New York City. Others begin gathering around the Watchtower. Lindy Reynolds apologizes to her husband for doubting him. Reed Richards then steps up, and the Sentry asks why Reed betrayed him, except Reed still can't remember exactly what happened, only that the Sentry became a threat. Sentry brushes Richards off as everyone, including Scout, begin waiting for the Void.
It's at this point that we actually abandon the main story of the Sentry and divert into a series of one-shot stories in which Reed Richards, Peter Parker, the Incredible Hulk, and Archangel of the X-Men all remember past encounters they had with the Sentry.
Mr. Fantastic recalls a time when he and the Sentry were using Clock to study a cosmic cube. However, the Watchtower's artificial intelligence accidentally absorbed the cube. Sentry and Richards had to journey into Clock's mainframe to prevent the computer from possibly taking over the world. Afterwards, Bob and Lindy came over to the Baxter building for a cookout with the Fantastic Four. Spider-Man flashes back to a time when the Sentry came to him seeking help with Dr. Octopus. The two made quick work of Doc Ock, and then the Sentry revealed the real reason he came to Spidey. He asks Peter Parker to take a picture of him and thus be the first documented evidence of the Sentry. Peter snaps the picture, which a giddy J. Jonah Jameson publishes in Clarion Magazine issue number 473, leading to Peter Parker winning a Pulitzer Prize. The Incredible Hulk remembers how the Sentry was the only one who ever really trusted him. The Sentry worked tirelessly to tame the rampaging gamma-powered creature. However, the two then encountered the Void. The Hulk lunged at the Void, and within seconds of making contact, the Hulk felt something new. Fear. It was enough for the Hulk to just run away. Finally, we have Archangel of the X-Men remembering how one time he charged headstrong into a Danger Room simulation, and this resulted in Cyclops being killed in terms of the simulation. Warren stormed out after Xavier chastised him. Not too long afterwards, Angel encountered the Sentry. The two worked together on several missions, and the Winged Mutant learned the virtue of patience. Returning to the present, the Void arrives in New York City. Black tendrils shoot out and make contact with Spider-Man, Hulk, and Thor. It's then that Reed Richards remembers everything. Why he betrayed the Sentry, why everyone's minds had to be wiped, and most important of all, the identity of the Void.
Basically, it turned out that the Void is actually the manifestation of the darker aspects of Robert Reynolds' personality. On top of all this, Reynolds became addicted to the serum that bestowed him his powers to become the Sentry. So every time the Sentry became stronger, the Void also became stronger.
Reed, along with the members of the Avengers and Doctor Strange, confronted the Sentry. Eventually, the Sentry realized the truth. The only way to stop the Void was for the Sentry to go away forever. The Sentry staged his death, with Reed Richards revealing that the hero was on the take at the funeral. Afterwards, Mr. Fantastic worked with the Sentry on the memory-scrambling transmitter. Before the device was turned on, Reed made the VHS tape and then made Doctor Strange promise to make sure that no one ever remembered the Sentry.
And we've now seen how successful that turned out to be. Sorcerer Supreme indeed.
The Sentry also begins to remember. However, the Void does his best to dissuade his better half. Eventually, the Sentry realizes what must be done. The transmitter needs to be turned back on. The Void begins to weaken as the Sentry and Reed return to the Watchtower. There, the two manage to turn the transmitter back on, and Sentry reminds Clock to never try contacting him again. The Void vanishes and the world returns to normal, and the heroes are just standing around wondering why on earth they're in the middle of New York City. A few weeks later, Bob and Lindy leave the house and go out to eat. Bob's agoraphobia begins to act up when he suddenly notices a very familiar-looking server at the restaurant. Bob then remembers the Sentry and Scout's favorite meal: chili dogs.
And so ends the Sentry. Except we've got to cover one last bit about the Sentry's creation. There was no Artie Rosen. No forgotten Marvel Comics bullpen artist who died without ever giving his fair chance. No Marvel version of Superman that predated the Fantastic Four. Basically, that whole part was just one big publicity stunt.
Okay, full story here. Writer Paul Jenkins and another writer named Rick Veitch created a pitch for a series based on the Golden Age DC Comics hero Hourman. However, Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada read the pitch first and convinced Jenkins to alter the story so it could be done at Marvel. Veitch would leave the project soon thereafter. Quesada also conceived the idea of making the Sentry a forgotten Stan Lee creation. Jenkins wasn't on board at first until Lee gave his blessing, citing that his memory wasn't so good, so maybe he actually did create a hero that never got published. The whole stunt was revealed in issue 116 of Wizard magazine, which came out a little over a year after the initial Artie Rosen story was published.
And that's kind of the sad thing about this. The whole publicity stunt thing sort of overwhelmed the story, and, well, it really didn't need that. The Sentry is a pretty darn good story. It's got a real good flow to it. There's not a lot of dead space, except for one part which I'll cover eventually. Also, it's got some great Jay Lee artwork throughout this whole thing, and to be honest, they managed to work the Sentry into the Marvel Universe in a pretty interesting way. Now, like I said, with the drawbacks, other than the whole publicity stunt part, the whole one-shot issues where they divert right after the big climax with the Void, or everyone's gathering to take on the Void, and then we divert into the flashback issues. That just kind of causes the story to screech to a bit of a halt. It's really unnecessary. I wish it had been more like, say, Sentry encounters Reed Richards, and then Reed Richards remembers this past adventure with the Sentry. Sentry encounters Spider-Man, you get the idea. Also, the one thing that really keeps me from fully recommending this book is this thing is long out of print, and there is not a digital copy available on Comixology. I don't know about the Marvel Unlimited feature, but like I said, there's not another version that's readily available, which means that if you want a copy of this, you're going to have to go either bargain bin diving at a convention or maybe hope that there's like a cheapo version on eBay or something. With that in mind, I'm going to give the Sentry a C. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.